One shark is the SEC, the other the Big Ten. The guy in the middle, the other power conferences. Come on, fish! Come to Quint! And now, of course, we segue to the college football playoffs. Number 1, Georgia versus number 4, TCU. Number 2, Ohio State versus number 3, Michigan. Followed by Tennessee, LSU, USC, Alabama. The number 4 Horned Frogs are putting a crimp in our quest for football domination. Hi, everyone. This is Will O'Toole welcoming you to another edition of Park Ridge Sports History. And in this episode, I'd like to talk a little bit about the college football playoffs or the potential matchups for New Year's Day and all things during the holiday season. And then, of course, the championship game in 2023. But first, I would like to welcome you, as always, to the show. This week, I'd like to concentrate a little bit about college football. Probably is, outside of baseball, it's probably the one sport I follow more than anything else, with the addition of probably college baseball. And the reason being is that I have found, since I started watching with my dad and my brothers, that each week is kind of an elimination from whether you want to call it the playoffs, the bowl season, the hunt for number one, what have you. That each week in college football, at least when I was growing up, and now it has changed slightly, but you couldn't afford to lose. Or if you did lose, you had to lose early, because if you lost late, you were done. And with probably the evolution really being driven by the money aspect of the college football game, the game and the just the beauty of, let's say, the top 10 or the top 20, whether you agree with it or not, has changed significantly. And with that, we've talked about this in past episodes, and I was even theorizing how I do believe that eventually you're going to come down to probably 2 divisions or 2 super conferences, or even 1 super conference. I actually spoke about that during the summer, where you're only going to have 40 or possibly 50 teams competing for the national title, and then they'll have a huge playoff and all the rest of it. And this really has, for the majority, it's all the state schools, primarily coming from the Big Ten, the Southeast Conference, potentially the ACC, a little bit from the Pac-10 or Pac-12 as it is, and of course Notre Dame. And really, football is getting closer, at least the college is getting closer and closer to resembling the NFL. I don't think, and I've stated this before, it's not done yet with these teams jumping from conference to conference. The one that has pretty much the powers that be and all of college football, the Oklahoma and Texas move, really set off another jumping point of teams leaving one conference for the other. And the UCLA earlier in the year, back in June, has really set into motion all of these different combinations of conferences, or these different rumors that are going on. But with the NIL, along with the money just streaming in from different parts of the media, whether it's the internet or it's the social media or it's television itself, there's just an explosion of revenue for college football. And the college presidents and the leagues themselves are using it to their fullest. And you will see probably one day, and I don't even see it's within the next 20 years. I'm talking about maybe potentially the next 5 years, where you're just going to see the college football players paid like minor league, as if it's a minor league for the NFL. In fact, it's probably right now going on as I speak, but let's say not as formally, now not as overtly, and certainly what I'm thinking is the colleges just pay the players to participate on the football field, and it's going to have probably a trickle effect to the college basketball game as well. With that being said, this week, I, uh, as I mentioned last week, I've gotten aboard the TCU Express, first of all, because the two teams or the teams I normally root for, they're basically done. One, of course, is Notre Dame. You've heard me talk ad nauseum about the fact that Notre Dame, uh, they last won in 1988, and they really have not been a player. I know they've been to the college playoffs a couple of times. I know that they've had a couple of unbeaten teams, most recently about 3 years ago, and of course in 2012 where they're 12-0, and then they get to quote unquote the championship game and get smoked by Saban and the Alabama Crimson Tide. That was a game they weren't even close. And then of course they got smoked again by Clemson in one of the playoff games on New Year's Eve. That game wasn't even close as well. Uh, and still a little upset about that one, only because I felt Notre Dame should have should have performed much better and did. Happens. It just is. And I'm not giving credit where it's due, and that's the Clemson Tigers, who have been a real behemoth in the last 10 years of college football. There's something about that Paul, though, I just love, and they have one of the best helmets in all of college football. I may not root for them. I do, of course, love orange. I can't stand when they go to that really predominantly purple orange look, but I do love sometimes when they go to the full orange uniform. But without a doubt, that orange tiger paw print is just one of it's right up there with the Tar Heel, with the Notre Dame fighting leprechaun, with the Ohio State Buckeye, with the Texas Longhorn. I'm going to devote a show to some of the best college logos, whether it's on the helmet or just the logo in general. That being said, one of the reasons, and of course, this is being a kid, the most common nicknames in college sports, of course, is either Eagles or Tigers. So when along comes a team like TCU and they have a name called the Horned Frogs, you got to like them. And as a kid, once again, I love TCU. I'm not saying I'm on the bandwagon. Let's be honest with TCU. I know about as much about their history as I'm going to share with you today. Being a Notre Dame fan, I can probably name, I don't know, sometimes the sixth guy on the roster from the 68 team. But the TCU Horned Frogs is a great name. I don't think I've seen another, whether it's high school or college, with that nickname of the Horned Frogs. Yes, of course, you have the Maryland Terrapins, probably both in the reptile family. I get all that. And Terrapins, of course, is a unique name to the college ranks. But the Horned Frogs and the fact that they're purple and gray, to me, just adds a little bit of luster to what they've done. And I'd like to concentrate on what this season, because I am starting to tout TCU. I did watch them last night play Texas, which had moved into the top 25 of the college ranks. And after a slow start, they did lose by a point to Alabama. Of course, though, that was when Alabama was seen as the juggernaut of college football in September. Alabama has shown some weaknesses of late, but they're still in the hunt, even with the two losses, because both losses coming to SEC teams, and they've overwhelmed their competition outside the league. Face it, the SEC, and I've done a cartoon on this, so it's nothing new. The SEC is really second to none when it comes to college football. I know that there are certain moments that teams like a Michigan or Ohio State can defeat the SEC. I'm not saying that, but overall, I don't think anybody, without a doubt, would argue when I say that SEC football is probably the best brand of college football. Now, I'm not saying it's the most exciting, because I will just, but just as being they're second to none. The Pac-10 or the Pac-12, however you want to talk about it, no way. The Big Ten, no way. The ACC, it's a league I kind of like, the ACC, no way. And then, of course, you have your independents. And as I've stated before, Notre Dame has not really been a player since they signed the deal with the Peacock, and I recognize the fact that there was that bump between 88 and 90 called 1989, but they still didn't win there. They have not won, and they have not been a player. I am sorry. Uh, I know that they are still seen as part of the landscape of college football, but when when I was growing up, everybody seemed to be a Notre Dame fan who was in my parish or who had Irish descent or whatever. Now, it's the SEC or it's the Michigans or the Ohio States. There's a reason why we were called Subway fans, Notre Dame. You could go anywhere in the nation and you would find not just pockets, stadiums filled with Notre Dame fans. I mean, that's why they always played in Yankee Stadium quite a bit. That was the first experience I had with Notre Dame was at Yankee Stadium, 1969. And they were the be-all and end-all. College football started with them. And other squads, even Alabama, for as great as they've been, they're still seen as a regional team. Notre Dame they were like the Yankees, the Canadians, and the Celtics. And even, I would argue that even a bigger brand than those teams because they were still slightly more regional. Well, maybe not the Yankees, but certainly the Celtics, maybe the Lakers. But Notre Dame was a nationwide, and they built their team around that. Knute Rockne, or Knute Rockne, however you want to pronounce it, he was a genius when it came to scheduling. Right now, the team is it's good enough to probably play against the third or fourth ranked teams in the SEC. They're probably good enough to probably win the Western Division of the Big Ten, but they would get smoked by the main powers in these conferences. How do I know that? Well, take a look. Ohio State beat them, and that wasn't even a game. That was a beatdown. That was, if you watch that game earlier in the year, you're just waiting for Notre Dame to just fall apart because the defense kept them in the game. The offense couldn't do anything. And then Ohio State finally broke through. And really, that score, if there was 5 more minutes in the second half than in the first, Ohio State probably could have run up about 40, 45 points against the Irish. And then, of course, they lose to Marshall, which I believe going into yesterday's game was either 5-4 or 4-5. So it wasn't like a Coastal Carolina, which was having this unbelievable season where they were 10-0 and everything was fitting in. That Marshall team embarrassed Notre Dame in South Bend. And then, of course, they lost to a terrible Stanford team. And I know that's been a big rival for the Irish, so you can say, well, it's a rivalry type of game, but there's no way that Notre Dame should have lost 15-14 or 16-14 at home on a Saturday night to Stanford. I could even live with it if they went out to Palo Alto and lost out there during the holiday season, Thanksgiving. And now they have to play USC, which, of course, is one of the teams still vying for a spot in that Final Four of the Bowl Championship Series. And they got hurt yesterday with the fact that Oregon was beaten at home by Washington. And I'll tell you, it was a unique day for me because I was able to watch nonstop sports all day long for about 12, 15 hours. And all the games that I watched were very enjoyable. I watched West Virginia defeat Oklahoma 23-20. And what was great was that as the day progressed, I was watching more and more snowfall in some of the games. It even snowed during the game with Arkansas and LSU, which ironically has put itself into a position where they could, if it breaks well for them, could finish in the Final Four, if things broke for them with 2 losses. So it's pretty interesting. And getting back to that, I with the expansion of the playoffs that's coming supposedly in 2025 or 2024, I think it's 25. You may even see that ramped up a little bit more. I can see the SEC and the Big Ten really pushing for this because, as my cartoon stated, I'm looking at this of the 8 teams that are listed. Take a look. You have Georgia, SEC. You have Tennessee, SEC. LSU, SEC. Alabama, SEC. And when you think about it, the other team in that, with the exception of TCU, USC is going to belong to the Big Ten. So of the 8 schools, or the 8 schools listed, 7 of them are either going to be joining the Big Ten or SEC, or are already in the league. So it's kind of crazy. And this is why I'm really rooting for TCU. Probably they would get more respect if right now the Big Ten or the Southeast Conference offer them membership into their conference. I could see them doing that in a midnight kind of ballot for them and say, "Hey, listen, now you're in the SEC. Come and join us." But I was looking at TCU. They have a pretty good history. I'm not saying that they've had, and this is why they're an outlier. They don't have the football tradition, certainly of Alabama, or certainly of USC, or Michigan, or Ohio State. But they, in their by themselves, they've had a long, pretty good history. I grew up with them being terrible, but I never realized that during the 30s, and I'm going to give the man the most credit for this, is Dutch Meyer. Dutch Meyer was brought them to 5 big time bowl games. So when we're talking about the big bowl games, it really is still sugar, orange, cotton. Sugar, orange, cotton, and Orange Bowl. And I put on the outside, and this is just within the last, wow, I would say 30 years, the Fiesta Bowl. The funny thing is, the Gator and the Peach Bowl, and we've done this, and the Sun Bowl have been a, around as long as the others. The problem is the Orange Bowl was affiliated with the Big Eight at one point. The Sugar, of course, has been historically linked with the SEC, and of course the Rose Bowl. And I forgot the Rose Bowl, but setting aside, it's the granddaddy of them all. It does pit the Big Ten against the Pac-10, and I know that there have been games that have decided the national championship there, but they are the one bowl game that never could go out and really petition for the game that would decide the national championship. What do I mean by that? Well, 1969 and 70, you had Notre Dame and the great Texas teams. They faced each other in the Cotton Bowl. Of course, the Cotton Bowl awarded it to the Southwest Conference at the time, so the number one team would go. Texas, which won the Southwest Conference and happened to be number one, would take that spot. But then they could go out and invite whoever they wanted. And Notre Dame, of course, had good teams under Ara, and they would always try to play up because they knew that if they did win, and of course, 69 was their first time in a bowl game for years and years and years, Notre Dame. So they went out. They played for the national title and lost. The next year, even though they didn't win the national title, they stopped Texas from winning. So you can see. Meanwhile, the Big Ten, Pac 8, as it used to be, they never had the national championship game. They might have had the number one team who had to win to maintain that number one status, but very rarely did the national championship game wind up being in the Rose Bowl when I was a kid. It's only over the last 20, 25 years that you pitted, let's say, 2 teams that would vie for the national championship. And that was really forced by the college championship series or playoffs. So that's why I kind of put them. All right. So if you want to say it's the rose, the orange, the sugar, and the cotton, fine. I like to think it's the Fiesta Bowl. It'll never have the same rank. Unfortunately, none of those bowl games I just listed will ever have the image or the tradition or the look or status as the Rose Bowl. And it's kind of a shame because there have been great Orange Bowl games played. As I just said, great Cotton Bowl, great Sugar Bowls played. Still the greatest game I ever saw. Again, I have to, and I know I'm a Notre Dame fan, but Notre Dame, Alabama, 1973, New Year's Eve, was one of the great games I ever saw in my life, back and forth, and I've talked about that. Anyway, here's TCU under Dutch Meyer. Very good coach. In fact, he did bring them to 12-1 in 1935, and they won the Sugar Bowl. But he won the Sugar Bowl in 1938, going unbeaten, 11-0, Dutch Meyer, and he won the Sugar Bowl. And that was the first and only time that TCU finished as the number one school by the wire services in the land. Since then, after Dutch Meyer, Abe Martin took over. He still qualified for the Cotton Bowl a couple of times. In fact, he went 1-1-1 in the Cotton Bowl in 1955, 56, and then in 58. Then they played in one of my favorite names of all time. I wish they would restore this game, the Blue Bonnet. Actually, it was called, when it was played in the Astrodome, it was called the Astro Blue Bonnet Bowl. And of course, it was usually hosted by Houston every year. And then they played in the Sun Bowl in 1965. And then nothing. Now I know there weren't as many bowl games. Of course, Texas was on the rise then. They would become the big powerhouse of the Southwest Conference, playing for a number of national championship games. But TCU doesn't qualify for another bowl for almost 20 years, when one of my favorite coaches of all time, Jim Wacker, gets them into the Blue Bonnet Bowl in 1984. They finish with an 8-3 record. They lose the Blue Bonnet. They finish 8-4. Wacker, of course, lasted until 1991, when he was replaced by, everyone should know who I'm talking about here, Pat Sullivan, who was the Pat Sullivan who won the Heisman Trophy in 1971. Pat, of course, I always say should never have won, because I always thought Ed Marinara should have won that position. But Pat Sullivan was the Heisman Trophy winner, and he would become the TCU coach after Jim Wacker. I just want to make sure that I'm not talking through my head here. That I'm convinced. Yes, he was the head coach of TCU, and he was actually, I couldn't believe it. Pat Sullivan played. I'm just going on this right now, from 72 to 77 in the NFL. I didn't realize he lasted that long. But then TCU, they go back, and Wacker's replaced by Pat Sullivan. Pat Sullivan's record: 2-8-1, 4-7, 7-5, 6-5, 4-7, and 1-10. He's replaced by Dennis Franchione. Now Franchione has a great year in 2000. Here's where it kind of gets cool for TCU. They had played. Franchione takes over a team that went 1-10 with Pat Sullivan in 1997, and Franchione goes 7-5. So he turns them around. They win the Sun Bowl. Then they win the Mobile, Alabama Bowl the following year, going 8-4. Then he's going to the Alabama Bowl in 2000, when lo and behold, Franchione leaves and he takes the job at Alabama. And he's replaced by Gary Patterson, who unfortunately loses his first game as head coach with TCU. But it evolves, and Patterson, of course, is named head coach and stays head coach, leads TCU to a 6-6 game record the following year, where they qualify for, and this is just crazy, the Gallery Furniture Bowl. I couldn't even tell you where that's played unless I look it up right now, and I'm not going to do that. But where it used to be named after fruit or a resource that was that symbolized the area, now everything is named after a sponsor, whether you like it or not. I love when they have the ones that are named after bank products or named after banks. But even, unfortunately, I think it's called the Sunkist Orange Bowl. And it really is a shame that they've taken that novelty of naming football bowl games after resources. It's lost some of its. The bowl games have lost some of their unique qualities that made them so. So let's say, as a kid, and even as a probably as a college athlete, so awe-inspiring to be able to say, wow, we won that year. We won 10 games, and we won our conference, and we played in the Orange Bowl. Not Acme Wile E. Coyote Orange Bowl, just the Orange Bowl, or just the Rose Bowl, or just the Cotton Bowl. Just something about that, okay? A little bit campy, probably a little bit corny, maybe a little bit too Norman Rockwell for uh, people who don't enjoy Americana culture. But for me, I just love that. And then Patterson starts off, ready for this, after that 6-6 season. I always thought he was one of the best coaches. I'm not going to pronounce the Navy coaches guy, Ken Nuatamolo. I always I always destroy that. I think he's a great coach as well. But Patterson, I always thought was one of these underappreciated coaches. And of course, he was coaching at TCU, which is always going to live in the shadows or be in the shadows of the Texases and the Texas A&Ms, and even to the east LSU, and to the north Oklahoma, and to a certain extent Oklahoma State. Being a private school in Fort Worth, not even in Houston or in Dallas, uh, they are he was really overlooked, and so was the program, because over the next few years, now they were in the Mountain West and Conference USA, all right, but Patterson wins from 2011, excuse me, from 2003. Actually, go back from 2002 to 2011. He wins over 10 games in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 in 8 of those years. The other 2 years, he goes 5-6 and rallies and goes 8-5 in 2007. After that, 2011, guess what? He gets to join the Big 12. So when I say to you that the SEC and the Big 10, I can see them offering TCU immediate access to their conferences tomorrow, just so they would have the glut, all 4 teams, all 7 of the 8 teams up there, or no, all 8 teams either belonging to the Big 10 or the SEC. I can see that happening tomorrow. And he joins the Big 12, has 2 tough rides, but then goes 12-1, 11-2, followed by a 6-7 season, 11-3, 7-6, 5-7, 6-4. His best season, of course, was this one, and I'm saving it for last, and that was 2010. Now, he was on a roll. He won in a space of 4 years, 24, 36, 47 games, and won 47-5. And that team, it was his last or second to last year in the Mountain West Conference, but they actually got invited to the Rose Bowl. And this was a big deal, not only for TCU, but when I think about it, the Rose Bowl, because had things kind of fell into place, they might have finished number one. As it was, they finished number 2 that year. And who did they defeat? They defeated in the Rose Bowl Wisconsin. And let me just get you that year. In 2010, they finished number 2 in the final AP poll. They finished behind Auburn, which was 14-0. That was the year with Cam Newton. They defeated Oregon, I do believe, in the championship game. They finished number 1. I mean, Newton had just an unbelievable. I mean, he definitely had a Heisman type of year. They defeated Oregon in the BCS championship game, aka known as the Fiesta Bowl, because it's played in Glendale, Arizona. He had beaten South Carolina in the championship game, not Alabama, but he did beat Alabama. I kid you not. I remember that game. Alabama was up like 27-0 and lost the game 28-27. Newton just played out of his mind right after Alabama gets up big, and I was rooting for Alabama, obviously, because I was rooting for TCU to potentially play in the championship game. As it was, that TCU team, which was led by Andy Dalton, defeats Wisconsin in their bowl game, the Rose Bowl. So I always kind of like that. And interestingly enough, they beat them in the bowl game. Let me just see. Texas Christian finishing 13-0. Do I think they could have beaten Auburn? It would have been a fun game because you would have had 2 great college quarterbacks. Knows what I said? 2 great college quarterbacks playing one another. Wisconsin, they beat Wisconsin, which was ranked number 4, 21-19. So TCU did everything they had to do. They won. They just got bested by a year. And of course, the Southeast Conference, which is always going to have even today, I would say that the Southeast Conference and the Big Ten have a slight edge, kind of a home field advantage when it comes to the final polls because everyone recognizes that they play in the most difficult conference in college football, with the exception of Vanderbilt, with the exception right now, maybe South Carolina, that seems to always go 6-5, with a Kentucky team that lost actually yesterday to Vanderbilt, which has been competitive, but is mostly a basketball school. All those teams are pretty good. Even the two Mississippi teams, which really cancel each other out, uh, probably would do so. I would argue if you took those two Mississippi teams and placed them in the ACC, they'd probably dominate. If you put them in the pack in the Big Ten, they would probably be maybe they wouldn't be Michigan and Ohio State, but they certainly would be probably a little bit better than the Wisconsin and Iowas from year to year. Uh, you can argue with me. I don't really care about that. It's just that I just really starting to see. And of course, I was never a Southeast Conference fan at all, but without a doubt, it's the most competitive. It's the best uh, football being played in the college sports. So here's where TCU is right now. Uh, they are on the throes of potentially now. I just want to run by their schedule right now. Here's why, I was saying this. TCU beat, in order, Oklahoma, basically destroyed their season. Beat Kansas, basically destroyed their season. Beat Oklahoma State, basically destroyed their season. Beat Kansas State, which still has a chance in their Big 12 to play in the championship game. They beat 4 top 20 teams in a row. And then they went out, beat West Virginia and Texas Tech, and then last night beat number 18 Texas. They have beaten 5 of the last 7 opponents have been ranked, and they have to finish with Baylor, very competitive. Iowa State, a little bit, like I like to say, a little bit under the weather, and then they would play in the championship game. So they could conceivably go right now. They are 10-0. They can go 13-0 and then potentially play in the Final Four. So 15 games. They'll have to win another 5. Here's the problem with TCU. No matter which game they lose, they're going to be bounced. That's why I'm rooting for them. They're going to be bounced because they are going to say that even though they've beaten a number of teams in a row that were all ranked, the SEC or the Big Ten, they're going to say, is probably better. Because here's the problem that they have. They are facing Michigan, which still has to play Ohio State. Both teams are, one of them is going to be defeated, 10-1. The other one's going to go on to the bowl champion or the Big Ten conference and probably win that. Now, if they lose that game, let's just say Ohio State beat Michigan, and then Ohio State lost in their Big Ten championship. You got 2 teams with 1 loss. Michigan might jump Ohio State and get in because they lost to Ohio State. I know this sounds crazy. Whereas Ohio State lost to the runner-up over in the West, whether it's Wisconsin or Iowa. It's not or Illinois, I think. It's not a very good division on the west side of the Big Ten. Then you have this. LSU could really stake a claim because if they win, I think they clinched the Southeast Conference West. They'll be playing the championship game. So if they win out, let's just say I think they'll be 11-2. Their 2 losses have come to Florida State early in the year, which has since started to really mobilize and really play well. And then, of course, they lost to an SEC team. But they beat Alabama. And with a gutty move, not going to overtime, but winning with a 2-point conversion. So TCU would probably be on the outsides. They have no room for a loss, whether it's next week against Baylor or in the Big 12 championship. They have no room for a loss. Meanwhile, Alabama, they're still clawing to that hope that they can get somehow involved in those 4 spots. Georgia, what they would probably root for is somehow, some way, Georgia loses. I doubt it. They still have to play Georgia Tech. They'll probably maul them. And like I said, I don't see anybody really giving Georgia any kind of a problem. You have Tennessee that could get back in there, especially if, let's say, Georgia lost, and I know Tennessee lost, but Tennessee could make the claim, we still beat Alabama. That's going a long way. We still beat Alabama. And you got to be honest, Alabama only lost 2 games. They lost to LSU and they lost to Tennessee. And they lost basically by a field goal and a conversion point and a 2-point conversion. And yesterday I saw them play Mississippi. They made a couple of, I thought, you know, non-Saban like moves towards the end, but they still won the game 30-23 or 30-24. Stopped Mississippi from scoring. That's another story unto itself. But TCU, a lot of fun. They're Max Duggan is their quarterback. They got some good receivers. They have a nice defense. I know they only escaped last night, Texas 17-10, but they did what they had to do. They won and they're moving on. And I do believe the fact that here's what's helping TCU. If they go the rest of the way unbeaten, I think they've locked up at least the number 4 seed. Potentially, it could probably move to number 3. What is helping them along the way, I think, with the polls, with the people who are voting it, is the fact that they now have 5 wins against top 20 teams and 4 in a row. And the only other team I said that I saw do that was Alabama, where they won 4 in a row against top 20. And when I'm talking, and here's the funny thing, they beat Oklahoma. Okay, they were 18. It's not a vintage. It's nowhere near a vintage Oklahoma team. They had already been beaten Oklahoma when TCU faced them, but they still are Oklahoma. They still have that DNA. Then they beat Kansas, which was going to have a nice story. That game actually went back and forth. They knocked out, I believe, the quarterback in that game, and then he was replaced, and he played great. And they won basically in the last stages of that game. So they've been real comeback kids. And then they beat Oklahoma State. I mean, they were down to Oklahoma State, just like they were in the 2 previous, come back and beat Oklahoma State. And that game probably has destroyed Oklahoma State because they got destroyed, shut out, I think 41-0 or something like that in their next outing. And then Kansas State, which was pretty good. Now, I'm not saying they're more like the teams that I'm talking about, Kansas and Kansas State. They were playing more like Iowa this year. So if you see those teams, they're kind of duplicate Iowa, maybe Wisconsin type of teams. Good, not great, but still good, and they're ranked, and they're still better than a lot of other teams in other conferences that are seen. West Virginia, they defeat Texas Tech. They had to come back and rally in that. Even in the West Virginia game, because that was played in West Virginia, they had to rally. This team is exciting because of all their comebacks. And of course, even in the Texas game, now I know it was juxtaposed with the Oregon and Washington game last night, which had quite a few fireworks back and forth. The game was much, quote unquote, for a football fan who loves scoring, who loves all that excitement. The Oregon Washington game was a great game, and it did come down to one play and all the rest of it. But if you were really watching kind of like nuanced football, the Texas TCU game was pretty exciting too because it was only 3-0, and TCU couldn't move the ball against Texas. So it really was a defensive battle. And then TCU had a couple of big plays in the game. They got some breathing room. And then, of course, Texas makes it tight, scooping up a fumble from Max Duggan, who did not really play well, but he did all the things to help them win. And if he does win the Heisman, it's because the voters are going to say, well, he did things to help them win. Doesn't have technically great stats, but he is leading a team that won't be there again. I'm telling you right now, kind of like the Cincinnati. We're Cincinnati this year. All right. I know it's not in as big a program or in as big a conference and stuff as TCU is in the Big 12, but TCU might not get this chance again for another decade. And that's why I think Dugan has done so much rallying his troops, doing everything he can to just get TCU in this position to go unbeaten. That he's going to get, I think, as it goes on. He may start pulling in some more Heisman support, and you might see Max Dugan in New York on that Saturday evening, potentially accepting a Heisman Trophy. It should be fun. It is going to change. I'm going to go back to the cartoon. I know this. Forget Oregon. They got beaten. That's why they're not in. And that's why this is subject to change, because I don't know where they're going to look at Alabama. Do the voters push Alabama ahead of USC? Because Alabama did beat a top 15 team in Ole Miss last night in Ole Miss. Meanwhile, USC, like all the Pac-10 teams, are using Colorado as a welcome mat. Plus, USC lost a very good player last night. I think he might be out for the season. One of their stalwart offensive players. LSU, of course, has rallied themselves. I think people are looking at that Florida State game. He missed an extra point as something in their rearview mirror, and they're looking at LSU as another SEC powerhouse, and they're back in it. And of course, you can't keep out Tennessee. They're exciting with their quarterback, who's probably, I mean, what he did yesterday against Missouri. But I actually see potentially among the voters, maybe Alabama jumping above USC simply because they beat a ranked opponent. And USC now, really, here's the only way USC, they got to hope, obviously they got to beat Notre Dame, and they got to win against in their Pac-10, and they have to, I think they have not played UCLA, so they got to beat UCLA. But all their wins, unfortunately, are not as reputable or as credible, especially with Oregon losing, as anything that Alabama does from this point forward. So it should be interesting over the next 4 weeks in college football. Everyone, this is Will O'Toole thanking you for joining me for another Park Ridge Sports History. Thank you for joining me. Shout out to Howard Fredericks. See you next week, and we will talk baseball next week. Bye now.